And welcome to Question Christianity, where we try and give tough questions reasonable answers. Tonight, we are diving in. We're going to be talking about kosher food laws. Should Christians keep kosher? And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So stick around for the discussion. If you have questions related to it, be sure to throw them in chat. Comments are welcome as well. We look forward to hearing from anybody who's in the audience that has questions as we go through this. We are taking this from Paul Copan's Is God a Moral Monster? We've kind of been working our way through that for a few weeks.
Yep.
So be sure to check out some previous episodes, but you certainly don't have to get something from this conversation. We gear each week kind of independently as well, but they do build on one another. So we're glad to have you with us tonight. And Charles, we still got to do introductions. I'm Caleb.
Charles.
This man right down here.
Me? Oh, that's
there. I really screwed that up.
I'm Pete.
Yeah, and I'm Charles.
And that's Charles.
And Charles is leading us tonight. So
I'm going to try. So I'm hoping that instead of leading, I can just facilitate and we can get some discussion here. All right. So this is chapter 8, the Bible's ubiquitous weirdness, kosher foods and kooky laws, part 2. We talked some about this last time, as Caleb mentioned. So now we're going to actually dive into some of the specific laws and try to determine what the heck is going on in Deuteronomy. Some foods are good, some aren't. You can eat split-hoofed animals, but not pigs. It's just kind of it seems odd. So I think it's a valid criticism that, like, what the heck's going on in here, and why would God even care about what you're eating, among other things. So I thought maybe we could start out by doing what we typically do, which is steel manning the skeptic position.
Sure.
So I'm just going to throw out some things. Some animals are good to eat, some aren't. You can eat shellfish, or you can't eat shellfish, but you can eat regular fish. You can eat some kinds of birds, but not others. You can eat some types of insects and not others.
No, I've got a great steel man on this.
Grade it.
Okay, so the Jewish God, the Jewish and Christian God forbids the eating of bacon. Therefore, this God does not exist.
Wow, that's
all right. You may have us on that one. Joking. No, I think some people would say this. Look, you people say, in fact, it's even in your Bible, that your God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So why the big shift on, can't eat shrimp, can't eat lobster? I mean, come on. These are, and again, this is, I think that a lot of times you get people who they'll basically say that God, because God does not change, therefore his requirements don't change. But we can actually see his change. And I don't want to go into now.
No, I think that's a great steel man, because I think you're going to play it to the end. Then either this God who says he doesn't change does apparently change, or you guys aren't taking your faith seriously. And so you're picking and choosing what you want. And so you're somewhat changing, or being at least arbitrary in what you're doing and picking and choosing. We did talk about this a little bit last time, but maybe someone missed it. So, I mean, just to mix it in there and kind of steel man it a little bit more, here we're talking about certain foods, and I think probably just about every Christian would agree that these dietary laws don't affect us anymore, but yet we seem to be picking out some of the moral laws out of the same book, perhaps even the same chapters, and using those as clobber passages. So
Christians are really good at that.
the clobbering or the picking and choosing?
Both.
Yeah.
Both in combination, especially.
Yeah, and it seems like we're really good at honing in on sins that we believe are either highly embarrassing or our yucky ones, the ones that we particularly find offense with. And I've seen in churches, and this does not work to our defense, I've seen in churches where you're okay so long as you've committed, these handful of sins, these either okay sins, or churches who are, we're okay with you doing the bad ones so long as we can create a video about you and your life change and how you changed your life and how our church was instrumental in that. Very little about the grace of God and God working in your life. I mean, don't get me wrong, they'll make videos about it. Or if you are a really good donor and you give big in the offering plate, we'll either overlook or be okay with your dirty past. Yeah.
Modern day indulgence.
Yeah. And so I see why a lot of people who are atheists, people who are agnostic, people who are skeptics, people who've been hurt by churches, utilize the law and the moral law and all the various weirdnesses as going, well, your book's really against all these things, but you're okay with them so long as people will line your pockets, or and they give a lot of that type of defense against of their skepticism.
Yeah, not to get too far off topic, but I'm guessing you were talking before the show, Caleb, about deconversion, and I'm guessing at least a number of those stories involve some type of emotional pain instead of intellectual. Maybe a combination.
So, to throw a shout out there to Joe Furchess, he's the one who's done a lot of this research in looking into these deconversion stories. But yeah, I mean, you almost always have doubts that continue to pile up, and then you have some kind of triggering event. Usually it's a very emotional one that actually triggers kind of that final step into or away from Christianity, if you will. It's a gradual process as it is, but there's always usually a trigger event that really kind of pushes somebody to explore their doubts within their faith. And then if they haven't been prepared for that well, it usually does not go well.
Yeah, I totally get that. And we are human beings, and as much, especially guys, like to try to pretend like we don't have emotions. We absolutely do. Let someone cut in front of you in line and see if you don't have some type of emotion about that. And that, if nothing else, that just, I think, should be a reminder to all of us Christians that how we present ourselves to other people. Now, sometimes you can't avoid, and we've said this before, the message should be offensive, not the person. So there are some parts of the Christian message that are absolutely going to be offensive, especially today's culture. And they're just going to have to remain offensive, but we don't have to be offensive. Matter of fact, the more we as human beings can try to avoid that pain, because man, I've certainly experienced this, and my guess is you guys have too. If you upset someone, it doesn't matter how logical you'll be, they'll find a reason to disagree with you because you've hurt them. And it's really like 1 in 100 people that can bypass, the hurt that you're giving them to agree with you intellectually. That's the exception, not the rule. So anyway, all right. That's a pretty good steal, man. Any other final notes to that?
So I feel like there's probably more, and I would love for anybody who might be watching to say, hey, you didn't address mine. I feel like that I've got a really good argument as to why I think these odd laws in the Old Testament in particular work against biblical accuracy or the believability of the Bible and Christianity. I definitely would love to invite that, and I don't want to just say, hey, because we didn't say it, it doesn't count. I mean, you may have one that we haven't thought of, or one we failed to mention or we forgot.
Mm-hmm. And with this, there's also one other thing that I think is important it's the fact that there's more that comes with this as well. With this objection, there is also a backing behind it, and this reasoning behind it, that humanity is progressing, adapting, and getting better morally. A very humanistic uh, model, if you would. And so, to somebody who holds this position, one thing that I think is very critical for understanding it from their perspective is that it's this whole mentality behind it of the Bible is a really old book with laws that we know don't make sense anymore. And some people would even argue that Christianity was an improvement on that, especially progressive Christianity. They would argue, okay, Jesus came along, he improved things better, still wasn't as good as it could get. There's going to be more improvement. So that kind of thing is often kind of the narrative.
Gosh,
that
I could
underlies
dig
a lot
into
of
that
this.
one, man. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Of course, improvement means it's moving towards something that's better. And cultures, what they usually mean by that is the closer that your religion gets to our current culture as it is now, the more sense it makes. And of course, cultures change, so that's actually a moving target. That assumes a moral law that things are getting better. But aside from that, I actually don't want to. Those are great steel mans. I think actually we've talked about those before. So instead of really diving in, those I think it's good to just recognize, even if we don't cover them right here, we're not trying to hide from any of those. I mean, I think that's one of the most important things about Steelman. It's like we get it as well. Like Pete said, we might be missing something, but I think these are some of the more common ones that I've heard, and so we're not trying to hide from these. I think we did a pretty good job of hammering those in the last session. So if any of our listeners want to go back and because we Steelmanned a lot of stuff, and then we're probably not going to answer that now, but it's because we've already answered it pretty fully last time. And if not, then reach out to us and let us know. Okay, so here's what Paul Copan does. I kind of like the approach, and I'm going to tell you guys up front. I'm not sure I agree with everything in this chapter, believe it or not. I think he's on to some of it some time, and so maybe we can have a healthy debate here. But I'm not fully on board with the way Paul's going on this.
I felt kind of the same way.
Okay. So that's interesting, and maybe we can discuss that. Paul Copan's book is a fantastic book. I feel like this might be the weakest part. He certainly had some extremely solid answers, so I would not want anyone at all to dismiss the book as a absolutely invaluable resource. That said, I think he might be on to something in some parts, but man, there's some parts I can't fully buy. So I think we'll talk about the kosher laws first. So kosher laws, maybe someone's not familiar with that. It's just the Orthodox Jews today, and well, Jews back then, there were certain foods that they could eat and certain foods they couldn't eat. Of course, that's what we were hinting at before, like shellfish and other things. If it was something they could eat, then that's considered kosher. And if it's something they couldn't, then it was considered unclean and they can't eat it. Some animals they couldn't eat, but they could still touch. But, and some, if you touched it, and again, we talked about this before, if you touch something that was unclean, it made you unclean. This is not the same as morally unclean. This is a ceremonial uncleanness. So you could touch a dead body. Matter of fact, you were supposed to touch a dead body. You're supposed to take care of the dead and prepare them in a certain way and honor the dead person. However, if you did that, it made you ceremonially unclean, not morally unclean, not at all morally unclean. Okay, but so I at least give him credit because he steelmans some of the approaches that I think we've taken. So here's a potential. Let me start by this. I just want to throw this out there. These laws do seem very odd. And instead of just dismissing that, I would like you to just think, could there possibly be, although it may not seem obvious, could there be a good reason why God would want to have a people follow certain eating and dietary laws? Like, might there be a reason? because just allowing for that possibility, I think, is going to open up a lot of doors. Instead of just dismissing it, like there might actually be a reason. Maybe it's not obvious to me, and what might it be? So here's one idea. So first he talks about the health and hygiene argument. In other words, some of these laws might be for health or hygiene. So any of you guys want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll hit the shellfish thing. I mean, I've heard the health and hygiene argument. Shellfish is one of those odd ones where, and it was an odd thing where I know a lady who they used to go down to Myrtle Beach or go on like a beach vacation, and every year they'd come back. And they always stopped at this one restaurant. It was a seafood restaurant. I don't know which one. I don't know where it was. But they were seafood fanatics, and it was a ladies' trip. And so this family was friends of ours, and the husband was reporting back, said, hey, they went on this trip as usual, came back, stopped at this, this seafood restaurant, and his wife had gotten the same kind of thing she always gets, and while they're sitting there, they start noticing her face is getting puffy and her ear starts to swell and she's having a little trouble breathing. And when they noticed it, she immediately grabbed a hold of some, like I think she downed a handful of, I don't know how much, but she downed some Benadryl or something to kind of hit the swelling, and then went to a doctor. And she had become deathly allergic to shellfish. And the doctor said, you will never eat seafood again. And so, to my knowledge, she never has. I don't keep up with their eating habits, but it was the whole thing of, and what I had heard was that shellfish and those types of things can hit you with an allergy at the drop of a hat and drop you. And you ate shrimp yesterday, but today you're now magically allergic. And God knew that was likely to happen and can happen. I don't know if that's a real reason. Again, God knows far more than I do. I'm certain he knows more health benefits of food. There's another gentleman, I'm not going to say his name. I don't want to give his ministry any props, but he's made big claims. He had some major health problems, and he changed his diet to the biblical diet. And now magically he's all the better. And look, if that really has worked for him, man, that's awesome. That's great. But there comes a point where I look at it and say, hey, you're going to utilize this as leverage and exact the dietary law, which we agree doesn't have the weight of the moral law. And he's going to take that. And even if he doesn't turn it into the moral law, sometimes the folks who hear him, they always take it the one step further. Hey, you shouldn't be eating that. It's, you might still be saved, but you're going to go to heaven earlier. And it's just like, it's another form of righteousness that I can't live up to.
Well,
long live bacon.
I'll jump in here real quick, and I'm going to kind of refute that approach just a little bit. We've got some real interesting research in just the last few years on peanuts. All daycares and a lot of school zones now have peanut-free zone signs up. Well, that started popping up before we saw a dramatic rise in the increase of peanut allergies. So actually, pediatricians recommended for years and years, keep your kids away from peanuts. It actually did more damage because lack of exposure to these things
100%.
created or it allowed the genetic dispositions to this that were already there to develop more. So we actually saw a huge increase in allergies when it was removed. So, I'm not sure the allergy thing would hold up, but like with pork, especially, if you don't have the modern methods to
raise pigs,
well, not just that, but to preserve it, you've got to worry about parasites and other bacteria that certainly without modern equipment could make it much, much harder to safely eat. If you will.
And by the way, I wouldn't necessarily say that the health and is the reason. But that's to kind of say, hey, I've heard that reason, and here are some of the supports I've heard people who take that reason on. And those are the supports they often give.
I think that's fair. I think that's
I
very
like
fair
the
to
health
bring it up.
reason. So I think the health is a legitimate reason. Now, here's the thing. Here's the beautiful thing about this. And I do say beautiful. I don't think we have to know exactly what the answer is. I think it's actually good enough to throw out some legitimately reasonable ideas that may or may not be, because what we're trying to refute is that they're totally off base and there's no reason whatsoever. And so if we can at least just think of one reason, then we're like, well, that's a potential reason. It seems like that might be a good reason. It might or might not. I'm not going to try to read God's mind, but I mean, if health seems like at least a reasonable reason, then it might be. I also think this, and I think this is a very healthy thing. If there was just one reason, I'd be a little disappointed. If God said you can't eat pigs, and the one reason is because of trichinosis, I put them on the list because that one thing, it'd be a little disappointing. And God seems to work in layers on almost everything He does. The stories in Genesis, the more you read them, I mean, you just got to listen to like just one Jordan Peterson, and he's not even a Christian. That's kind of the point, right? He's not even a Christian, and the layers of detail that he pulls out of the Genesis story, and I think the layers he pulls out are legitimate, even without like the spiritual side. I think they also have the spiritual side, and just even on the non-spiritual side, the amount of layering that is legitimate in there is just amazing. So I don't think we have to be tied to like, this is the reason. I think that would be actually disappointing. I think it could be a plethora of reasons. It might be one we haven't thought of. But even if we don't know the reason, just to come up with a valid one. Okay, so here's what Paul Copan says about health. He says, here's the problem with that. The health ideas just isn't a concern in Leviticus 11 or elsewhere in the Old Testament. Says who? It seems like circular reasoning to me. That begs the question. I think it is the health, and you can't just dismiss it like that.
Well, and I see where he's going with this, because he also points out, hey, why doesn't he specifically mention plants that are poisonous and various things? Hey, those are unclean.
Right. I got an answer to that. I have a very good answer to that. Okay, that's the next sentence. He says, and why aren't poisonous plants considered unclean? I don't know, but I have a pretty legitimate reason, which is poisonous plants are always poisonous. Like if you eat that plant, it's always poisonous. Poisonous today, it's poisonous yesterday. If you eat it like in September, it's poisonous. Shellfish is a little weird. There are actually seasons where if you eat shellfish, it's fine, and other seasons, if you do, you're not. And it's weird. It's like, what is that thing? It's like months that contain R or something like that. It's like, I don't know if you guys have heard that, but it's a real thing. Like there are certain months, and it's not like every month. It's not just like in winter. It's weird, and it has to do with things that actually I don't know, but I know for a long time that was like months that have R in it. Anyway, so pigs with trichinosis, do they all have trichinosis 100% of the time? Probably not. And so it's kind of a gamble. So it's like, oh, you think you're good, and then you ate pork, and then all of a sudden it's like, bam, you get hammered. Poisonous plants, always poisonous. So is that the reason? I don't know. I'm just saying it seems like a legitimate disambiguation. Like wheat's always going to be good. There's never a time where wheat like starts developing trichinosis. You can eat wheat whenever it is ready for harvest, and then you can make bread, and you're not going to, something's weird going to happen. Now, I'm going to be honest. I think there's still things that are probably not going to be really clear on that. So there might be some overlap with some other ideas. Let me finish the other ones, and I'll let you guys comment. So, and why aren't plants poisonous? We talked about that. And to top it off, why did Jesus declare all these foods clean if health was really the issue in the kosher food section of the Old Testament? I think because it's the Old Testament, and technology had increased, and so the ability to recognize and to kind of nail down when it was okay. I mean, we're talking about in the beginning a pretty primitive society who was just kind of figuring out, like, they're migratory. They're coming into an area where maybe they got some pigs, where pig farming wasn't a big thing before, or some other things, or new species of plants. Like, you don't know yet. You're new. Here's what you can eat. It'll be pretty safe.
Sure.
All right, comments.
Well, first off, I'm going to say something about wheat. I think that we all need to understand that in kind of like in months that contain the letter R, in states that contain the letter California, wheat is actually unclean because it contains gluten. Sorry, that was a joke. You could literally hold up a bank with a bagel in some states. But
Thank you for that
yeah,
thing. All right.
I had to throw some humor in this.
Association with non-Israelite religion. So this is another argument. I had actually not heard this before, but again, it seems plausible. And again, I think there might be layering here, but the argument itself is animals were considered unclean because they were associated with non-Israelite religions in the ancient Near East. Problem with that, says Paul Copan, if that's the case, the bull should have been an abomination. After all, this animal was central to Canaanite and Egyptian religion. Great point. Great point, Paul.
Is it though? Is it though? Because I mean, in reality, we see a lot of this mirroring kind of within Scripture in how it looks at other religions. So if the bull is a central figure in some of these other religions, why wouldn't it be that which is sacrificed, if you will?
Go eat it.
You know, right. Like
Right.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
in some sense, it could be very much a mockery.
How much eating of bulls is there in India?
Right.
Well, and I'll point this out that, and I don't know if this is true. I'd heard this, so those of you who may know, that the bull and the cow were considered as, and the reason why the cow and the bull were considered holy or somehow sacred, or at least useful in religion, specifically in the Egyptian, is that God rested on the back of a bull or something like that, which is why, and again, this is something I'd heard. I'm curious if this is true, which is why when they built the golden calf, they considered that God was supposed to have inhabited the bull or something like that. Again, I'm just curious if that's true. But the reason why I point that out, not knowing that it's true or not, is that there may be some oddities of those religions where the animal itself was clean, able to be eaten, and it was also possibly even a slap towards the Egyptians or towards a nation which thought, hey, this is a holy animal. Yeah, we're going to eat it. It's going to be McDonald's.
Well, here's what we know for sure. Here's what is absolutely clear. God called a nation out of many nations and desired that nation to be set apart. That is not ambiguous. That is absolutely clear. So, might it be health? Maybe. Might it be association with non-Israelite religions? Maybe. Might it be what Paul Copan will bring up with this is the blurring of boundaries, like land, air, and sea? Maybe. I actually think that's one to at least ponder. That's interesting. I got some problems with some of his arguments, which I want to go into, but it's at least something that I think is kind of closer, because now we're really getting to it. My guess is that God cared a lot more about keeping Israel separate than he did about literally what they were putting in their mouths as nourishment. I think he did care about the health. I think he definitely cared about them not participating in other religious activities. And certainly he wanted to keep them separate. So here's a little play on that last point. Paul says association with non-Israel religions, and then he kind of blows it out of the water. I think, as I was thinking about this, I think it's equally interesting to note food, and we have absolutely forgot about this in America. Food is a big deal in the ancient world. Like, that's your life. And the ability to get food was not always guaranteed. They had famines. When's the last time we had a famine in America? I mean, we can talk about malnutrition, and that's completely different to no food available and people are actually starving to death. That was not uncommon. You know, if you had a small crop and the weather didn't go right, you starved, and maybe you starved to death and your family starved to death. So food is a big deal. And if you have food that's available and yet you're not supposed to eat that, it's like, that's actually that's a big statement. All right, so the idea of eating food is a much more bigger deal than it is today. And I think one of the most remarkable ways to keep a culture separate from other cultures is to make their dietary practices completely different. Like you can eat that, and so
Yeah.
all of a sudden you're thinking about, hey, I'm gonna have, I think I'm gonna go marry that woman over there in the land of Canaan. It's like, and she comes over, she's like, hey, here's some bacon. You're like, get away from me. That's because the Israelites had,
No,
had
she
really
comes over and she's like, "Where do you want to eat?" And then you're like, "I don't know. Where do you want to eat?"
yeah, where
And
do you
then-
want it? And there's like, no,
yeah.
you tell me. I'll give you two choices. You pick one.
And then she suggests bacon.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah,
and
then you're like,
then you're no longer an
Can't do
Israelite.
that. Bacon
Right.
cheeseburgers. You can't mix the milk with the meat.
Well,
Wait, hold on. Let me finish. So if the Israelites would be tempted, which they were, which not only were they tempted, but sometimes they went all the way and just kind of merged, which was like, despite all these, we talked about this last time, despite all this stuff, they still went and merged. But if they were toying around with the idea of merging with another culture, just the dietary prohibitions themselves is a big obstacle to come over. It aids in keeping that nation separate. All right, what were you going to say, Pete?
So I was going to mention that, and I don't know about dietary, but I do know that the Egyptians, when Israel, when the tribes of Israel came in before Joseph, or under Joseph, they told them they could live in the land of Goshen because they were shepherds, and sheep, or at least herding of sheep, was detestable to the Egyptians. So there is ubiquitous weirdness among the Near Eastern cultures, and granted, we've got a book that describes and prescribes lots of those weirdnesses to a specific nation, but there were other cultures that had similar, hey, don't do that, don't do this. Granted, we're talking about people during a culture that one of the things that separated them is they didn't do child sacrifice. I don't know if any of you are against that. Yeah, I'm against that one. But they were in a culture that was normal, and so I kind of want to ride that one just a little bit into, and maybe some of you know what this is called, but it's kind of like where you look back at a historical era and you try to judge it by today's moral standards. But in reality, you kind of need to judge it based on the moral standards of the cultures around it and its time period. So there's a little bit of, sure, I think there's some latitude we can give to that time period. And I think we're saying this, we're not going to have the answers as to why no shrimp. We are going to say that, at that point in time, that there may be, in fact, it may be multiples of these things. It might be, hey, we want you as a nation to be fully set apart, and this is one of the reasons, and health, and.
Yes, that's
so
where
it could be all of them. And yeah, I agree with that. I'm not gonna say, hey, if you believe it's the health and dietary thing, we can't be friends. I'm going to simply say I don't know.
Yeah, but again, we don't have to know. All we have to do, as good apologists, is come up with reasonably good answers, because the attack is there's no good reason. The attack is there's no good reason. And so if we can say, well, here's a perfectly legitimate reason. It might be that. I don't know that it is, but that seems perfectly legitimate. Then all of a sudden there might be a good reason. And so you can't say there is no good reason. And that's all. I think we're trying to say here is, look, they do seem odd. There seems like there might be some pretty legitimate reasons here, right? Especially the social one. All right, so now here's the angle that Paul takes. He takes two angles. Angle one, creation. So if you look at Genesis 1, there are different creation periods, and that's actually really interesting to look at, because there's the creation of the water, and then the life that goes in the water, and then there's the creation of the land. They don't happen like water and then fish. It's like water, land, air, and then like fish, land animals, birds, and stuff like that. It's very interesting how that works, and I might have that a little wrong, but it's something very close to that. Okay, so those things happen on different days, and so Paul's argument is that things that blur those boundaries, things that blur the boundaries between water and land or land and air, things that blur those boundaries are prohibited as a reason, again, and we're going to end up here again, as a reason to keep Israel reminded that blurring boundaries is bad. You don't blur boundaries. You do, because you cease to exist as a separate, unique nation if you blur boundaries. Okay, so water. To be clean, an aquatic animal must have scales and fins. So eels or shellfish are out, which don't fit this category and are unclean and thus prohibited. Okay, I think fair enough on that one. Thoughts on water? Okay, land. Clean animals are four-footed ones that hop, walk, or jump. A clear indication of a land animal's operating accordance to its sphere is that it, 1, has split hooves, and 2, is a cud chewer. These two features make obvious that an animal belongs to the land sphere. What? That one, I don't get it at all. It's like, why is it that a split hoof is more indicative of a land animal than a solid hoof? And why is it that chewing the cud is more indicative of a land animal instead of like a water animal? Like, no water animals chew the cud. I get it, but like that doesn't mean it's uniquely land. To me, this was the biggest breakdown. It's like that he talks about air and like penguins. Okay, I get it.
Yeah, this definitely seems like a reach. I'm not going to say it's totally false. I mean, again, when we all enter heaven, if he goes, "Hey, Paul Copan had it dead on the money,"
yeah,
or you go, "Wow, weird." Okay, next.
You know, if you were to take a, I think a slightly stronger version of this, you could take from a evolutionary theist perspective and say that, okay, there were separations between these boundaries. These are a lot of the same boundaries for animals that have died off, if you believe in evolution, you know, so you're losing a lot of those transitional species. And so I think that would actually make a stronger argument from an evolutionary perspective to say that, you know, at least from a symbolic perspective, there is a line being drawn here between these spheres, between transitional organisms, maybe for health reasons, maybe there's something genetically we don't know. I don't like it, but I still think it's stronger than
the thing is, it's like
presented.
It does, like his reasoning for the land falls apart, but the water and air, those do seem like they are blurring the boundary. So it's like there does seem like there's something here. It's like maybe if I heard a better argument for the land one, I could go all the way. But for me, it's like maybe jury's still a little out. And again, we're talking about layering, so this could be another layer. And maybe here's the other thing, and I think Pete kind of mentioned this. We don't have the cultural, insight now, and maybe if we went back 4,000 years and you said, like, what's the most land animal you'd ever seen? They would be like, well, it's anything with a split hoof that chews the cud. Like, everyone knows that. And you'd be like, oh, okay, now I understand. Like, in your culture, that was like the epitome of a land or herd animal. And if it didn't do that, then, it's not really a herd animal that you can eat. That's kind of like one of those weird things. We don't know. Well, and maybe with that insight, we would have a better understanding.
Yeah, maybe it's because I think that's critical, because we're sorry to cut you off there, Pete. I think we are missing something here, because I think this kind of explanation for these laws actually fits a narrative of morality changing and growing, because they seem, if we're basing it on these kind of distinctions of water, sea, air, it seems a little superstitious, if you will. So I think that this explanation actually fits skeptical narratives of it better than it does a Christian one.
Yeah, I'm like 80%, 70 to 80% there on this one. I like what you just said. It's like, I feel like I'm missing something. And to me, the reason I say that is it's not just like I don't get it at all. Like maybe it's like, no, there's enough there where I really feel like there's something there. You know, that blurring of the boundaries does seem pretty clear with like, it's got to have scales and fins. Like, in other words, it's got to be fishy. It's, you know, it's got fish. If it's a fish, it's got scales. It's not a fish. Don't eat it. You know, especially like shrimp. Like, think about a shrimp. Shrimp's kind of like a water spider. Matter of fact, we used to call them water bugs. You know, it was like in military when they had like seafood night, we call it bug night. You know, lobsters and shrimp, we called it bug night. Like, think about that. That was before I even read this chapter, because they're kind of buggy and spidery. Like a crab's like a big, huge underwater spider. So it does seem to kind of blur the boundary. Don't eat those. Like fish, fine. Land animals, birds, bird. Like a bird, and especially we'll get into like, and not a predator bird. Eat it. If it's not a bird, like don't eat a bat. That's a weird bird. Don't eat that thing, right? So I get it. But the land, it's like, I do feel like there's so much there, but I'm missing some piece of evidence that's going to make it click, and I don't know what that is yet. And that's okay. It's okay for me to not know.
And this is totally a stab. Have no idea if this is true. Somebody who's better at farm animaling might be more inclined to go, hey, that's totally off base. For example, pigs, if they're wild, they're omnivorous. They will eat anything. They will eat animal. They will eat plant. They will eat any kind of thing. But possibly God knew that, hey, these animals are easier to turn into livestock. You know, sheep, goats, and cattle, and cows, a handful of other animals. Again, I don't know what's totally the land animaliest. Maybe instead of it being land animal-y, maybe it's more of it is the easiest one to get to raise in large groups, and they are socialized together. Again, the one thing I want to say to the folks who are listening, who are skeptics, that are going to say, I don't buy that. I think Pete, Charles, and Caleb, they really missed the boat on the whole weirdness of farm animals. And I'll look at you and go, yeah, I don't think we know it. I don't think it's necessarily detrimental to the argument of whether or not there is a God. And I will say that,
oh my gosh, no. Yeah. Forget it.
I think that we can look at those and go, wow, those are odd things. And when we fast forward from the Old Testament into Jesus' day, when he sees people placing these overburdensome restrictions on their brothers and sisters and utilizing it to kind of strong arm their quote church, their synagogues, it was, hey, sure, I'm going to embrace these weirdnesses, but I'm not going to turn them into something where I strong arm people. Anyway,
I think trying to dismiss God's existence based on the Old Testament laws is an absolute non sequitur. There's clearly enough here that we've already, and we're not even done. Clearly, we've talked about that. It has at least some reasonableness to it, especially with the social non-blurring going on. You can't get there.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I think it's where those two narratives kind of veer off, because you've got this explanation of morality constantly improving. Mm-hmm. So we would expect old weird things in older religious texts, less weird stuff in newer religious texts. Okay, but the Christian alternative is not just some other version of that. The Christian narrative underlying all this is completely different. So you have, early on, you have man and woman told just to eat the fruit of the garden. Mm-hmm. They sin. They have to have a new covenant with God.
Gosh,
and it's there that they're given access to eating meat. And the first sacrifice is made. Then you see this covenant with this chosen people where they're forbidden of an awful lot of things that maybe we don't fully understand. And then we get to the time of Christ and the covenant with him, and the symbology that he brings to it is something that is so counter to the symbology we see in the Old Testament, because in Leviticus 17, we see a prohibition of blood, and yet Jesus says, this is my body, drink. Or this is my blood, drink. Same thing of his body. This is an idea that even today
that's so interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And what we see is then in the New
Man,
Testament,
that's exciting,
all
actually.
things are permissible.
Yes.
So-
That's. Go ahead.
So to
You
get
say
to
it.
the final point, the point is, this reminds me of being a parent completely and totally. I can look back on things my dad told me that I have no idea why on that particular day, that particular time, I was not allowed to do XYZ. I know I was told no, but I don't always know the reasons why I was given that. And yet we're seeing progressively people being given more and more freedom over their own choices as God is completing his covenant with people. I mean, that for me, it's like, okay, if we've got some weird Old Testament laws, they would be expected from a Christian perspective. There are going to be things we can look back and not understand about why God told that to that people.
Yeah. And you know what? So when you were saying that, man, I started thinking. I was like getting all excited. It's like, okay, I think one of the clearest things that there might be some things like yes or no. The thing about the distinction and the non-blurring seems to me to be just like that's a slam dunk. Whether or not we can figure out where it is in the land animals or whatever, that it's there's so much in the Old Testament. I mean, don't mix the linen with the with the wool. It's like, why? That only makes sense as a reminder to not mix things, not mix things, not mix things. Stay separate, stay separate, stay separate. And then, but that's Old Covenant. This nation is supposed to be isolated. And what happens in the New Covenant? The Old Covenant's gone. And what are Christians called to do? Go out and blend. Not dilute, but go and now go live to all nations. So that it's really interesting. It's like, when Peter in Acts, he's like, Peter, kill and eat. Like, no, Lord, never. No. I'm telling you, no, you will eat this. You're going to go, because you're going to go to everywhere around the world as a disciple of Christ. You're now called to now stop the distinction. I mean, I'm not saying the distinction of the faith. I'm talking about you're not now an isolated nation. Now you are to go among all nations. It's a really cool idea.
One thought I came up with it, and I don't know. What if the entire purpose of the dietary law was so that Peter would have that vision that a sheep being let down from heaven, being let down by the four corners, and out of it came every type of what he considered unclean food. Hey, I've seen all the Gentiles eat this stuff while traveling around, and seen them, bite the head off a scorpion, and I've recoiled. What if the entire purpose of that dietary law was so that God would have a very clear way to get across to Peter? By the way, don't you dare call something unclean that I've cleansed.
Yeah, well,
maybe.
Perhaps. I think
benefit.
I'm just going back and saying I don't think there is a reason. I think there are many reasons. I think this is a layered thing, and we might even nail down 2, 3, or 4, and it's it's going to be layers, because that just seems to be how God works in every other thing. But certainly the distinction thing, that's a really interesting point, Caleb. Where all of a sudden now you're supposed to now this is ended, go be among the nations. Go be among the nations. Okay, Paul's second point here, angle 2, and maybe I think we got enough time to hit this, and maybe not much more. Angle 2: the fall, death, and abnormality. So he likes the idea of the distinction. Well, he ties it to creation. Okay, I don't know if I tie it to creation, but I definitely like the distinction part. Now we're talking about the fall, death, and abnormality. And basically the point here is that anything that seems to symbolize or be involved with life or death or abnormality, out. Now, I'd like to separate those into 2 categories. I'd like to talk about life and death, and then I want to talk about abnormality, because those 2 things seem distinct to me, and they seem like you weren't prohibited against eating something. Like if there was a blemish on your sheep, like you could still eat the sheep. I mean, not if it was diseased, but if it wasn't perfect, if it had a little limp, you could still eat it. You couldn't sacrifice it, but you could eat it. And so that's not a dietary law. But there were things about life and death. So what's your guys' thoughts on that? You want me to give you a little cue, or you want to, I can read here. I'll read this. While specific kinds of foods, clothing, planning, and sexual relations in their respective spheres serve as a picture of Israel's set apartness from the nations, the distinction between clean and unclean animals in particular symbolizes how the Israelites were to act in relationship to their neighbors as well as to God.
Yeah. So one of the things I would say about that, like the idea of we're not going to eat predatory birds because we don't want to become predators. It seems like a stretch. I mean, I could definitely be wrong about this. To me, that seems like a stretch, or especially if it's the only reason. I could also see why not eating something that might be considered the victim, the eternal prey, is always going to be looked down upon because we as God's people are not to prey on the weak. But that said, I mean, if you think about what we're doing with cows and sheep and other things, I mean, we're specifically raising it to consume.
Yeah.
There's some oddity there. I don't think.
Let me. I'm going to read to you Leviticus because I was reading this before the podcast. So here's just the one on the birds, and I was keeping what he said in mind about the predator thing. And so here, I'm just going to read it right out of Bible Hub. I think this is in King James. Additionally, you are to detest the following birds, and they must not be eaten because they are detestable. Now think about predatory and scavengers. Okay, those two things, right? Because the scavengers like death, okay, predatory and scavenger. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, any kite of any kind, or any kind of falcon, raven, ostrich, screech owl, a gull, any kind of hawk, a little owl, a cormorant, I don't even know what that is, the great owl, white owl, desert owl. It's like no owls for you, man. No owls for dinner. The osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopie, Hoopoe, whatever, and the bat. Thoughts? No thoughts. I'm just like owls to me. It's like that's a list of predators and scavengers. I don't think there's an exception there.
And I would say that
anyone who's been to the beach and seen how a seagull acts, like that's a flippin' scavenger.
Yeah.
And I would say that maybe those types of, and it's possible those types of animals specifically had health reasons behind it. Hey, these things are likely to carry diseases that, I can cure you of it, but I'd rather you just simply avoid it.
Okay. But again, I think there's something to the predator thing. I'm not 100% there, but it's like there's. It seems interesting. I think it's at least reasonable. It's a reasonable approach. The predator, the predator, not the predator, but the prey animals. That one seemed weaker. I mean, because like sheep. Those things are prey, man. Sheep is prey.
I mean, anybody who's watched Wile E. Coyote knows they're prey.
Yeah. All right.
And maybe there's something there to the symbolism that also shows a place or order here as well. I think that especially within these Old Testament laws, it's really easy to overlook some of the symbolism. When blood is prohibited from being eaten in Leviticus 17, it deals with any man from the house of Israel or from the resident foreigners who live in their midst who eats any blood. I will set my face against that person who eats the blood, and I will cut him off from the midst of his people, for the life of every living thing is in the blood.
Yeah.
So there's also this symbolism, especially with blood, that the sacrificial animals have to be completely emptied of this. And in anything you're going to eat, you don't leave the blood in it before you cook it. I think a lot of this points towards the atonement,
for sure,
that Christ made.
Sure.
There's so much we could go into there, but I think that symbolism can't be overlooked here either.
I think we should,
just as I would say that applies to the early chapters of Genesis as well.
I'm looking at the clock. We got like 2 minutes left. Why don't we talk about the symbol? Because I think that deserves its own fair amount of time, because we can't ignore that. We can't look, especially when we talk about the pristineness of the sacrifices, how they're supposed to be unblemished, the deal with the blood, and all that goes in there, because as Christ said of himself, the whole Old Testament's about me, right? The scriptures, they're all about me. And so even when we look at Leviticus stops being boring when we start bringing Christ in, and not trying to pigeonhole him where he doesn't go. It's like, man, there's some pretty interesting things in here. So maybe I'll just guide us in closing there, and we can pick it up next time and talk about that.
Yeah. I would say the pristineness, there is a care that has to be taken, and this is a heavy assumption because I'm not a farmer, I'm not somebody who raises livestock, but I would make an assumption that there's a heavy amount of invested care that has to be taken in keeping this sheep, for 3 years, spotless, without blemish, no broken bones. I'm taking care of this thing.
Yeah.
I've got to care about this.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it.
So maybe that is, maybe not. Maybe it's a piece of the puzzle.
Well,
okay.
That's
we're going to save it for next time.
Next time, right?
Well,
all right. Well, with that, we hope you've enjoyed it. We would love to see some comments, questions, anything that comes to you after watching this. We'd love to hear it. We'd love to interact with it next time. We'll be back in a couple weeks. We'll continue this discussion. Until then, subscribe, click for notifications, all that good stuff. That would certainly help us out. Thumbs up or thumbs down, either way. But we appreciate the feedback. So hope everybody has a great night and got something out of the discussion.
Yeah. God bless.
See you next time.